But the phenomenal is that about which we can have knowledge. And so phenomenologists really retain that original existential starting point of understanding rooted in experience. But it's in lived experience. That's the crucial thing. So what becomes important in existential philosophy? If what we're trying to do is understand ourselves and the world in which we find ourselves, then, and we're doing that from the point of view of the I, the point of view of from inside out. What becomes important? Well, what becomes important is understanding what it means to be a thing like this. And so, what does that entail? Well, we have to address things like freedom, choice, living, death, our relationship to each other. Is it really one of conflict, or is there another way to characterize it? And our relationship to the universe. So what existentialism proposes to tell us about is not the stuff out there, but us in relation to the stuff out there. The stuff out there as it is inaccessible to us. But our relationship to it is accessible to us. Our relationship to each other is accessible to us. And I myself am accessible to myself. So that's really where existentialism focuses, on self-understanding and understanding in relation. Does that make sense? Good summary?
Indeed.
Thank you.
Indeed. Can I read something to you?
Yes, please.
Yeah.
I have these little selections I thought I could read, and then we can talk about them. As you can tell from this is the textbook that I use for the existentialism class. It is, you can't see inside the pages, but there are, pretty much every time I teach it, I make more marginal comments because something occurred to me that didn't occur to me before. Or something comes up in class that, I hadn't thought of that, so I go back and I read it over and I make more marginal notes, and then I say, oh, read this passage. So I've got we could just sit in class and read the whole book together out loud. And then talk about it. But let me see, I picked out some sections here. So I've got sections here from the French existentialists who are a little more accessible than others. And the French existentialists really had a way of beautifully combining philosophy with literature. Most of the philosophers in the existential tradition, who are in the French existential tradition, were also authors of fiction or plays or short stories and so forth. So they had this wonderful ability to convey these very complex philosophical ideas in seemingly innocent sounding words. See, so I'm going to read you from Camus. This is taken from The Stranger, which is one of Camus' literary works. I'll read that one. Change my mind. The Stranger is about the main character, Marceau, who murders a man who was walking along the beach, I believe, just murders him, and is arrested. And then the story really gets going when he's confronted with his own execution. So he's arrested, he's in prison, he has a trial, and the story really picks up after the trial. And we encounter Marceau as he's in prison awaiting his execution. And so he reflects on his life. And he had always maintained that he had no reason to kill the man Anyone like The Cure? The group The Cure? Yeah? They have a song based on this. It's called Killing an Arab. The Cure is a very existential group. I like them. I'm giving away my age. The 80s were a great era, if you understood it right. Part of it was good. The Cure was a good outcome. But, so I want to read for you this part where he's coming to terms with his execution. And it's like his understanding. Here's the thing about existentialists. There's this idea that when we properly understand our relationship, ourselves and our relationship to the world around us and to others around us, that understanding affects how you live. There's a how-ness to existence. There's a that you exist, and there's a what of your existence, right? Here, now, in this body, with this features, and this sex, and this height, and this age. Those are all the what questions that can be answered easy peasy, and they're boring, they're uninteresting. The how questions are the interesting ones. The how of your living. The meaning of your life to you as you live it. And so the idea with existentialism is that when we understand ourselves in the world, that fundamentally affects how we live it, or even whether we live it. Because for Camus, the first question of philosophy is suicide. But we'll get to that. This is a very happy, optimistic approach to the world. But it fundamentally changes how you are in the world. The how of your being is what's really at question. And so I'm going to read to you the section, just this passage here, where he comes to realize and understand his relationship to the world. And it changes how he is in the world. Before this, he was always confronting, resisting, rejecting authority, insulting, because who needs rules of manners? And so his way of being in the world was one of constant opposition and rejection, but futile, pointless, meaningless rejection, simply to reject. At this point, he understands why. Almost for the first time in many months, I thought of my mother. And now it seemed to me I understood why, at her life's end, she had taken on a fiancé. Why she played at making a fresh start. There too, in that home where lives were flickering out, the dusk came as a mournful solace. With death so near, Mother must have felt like someone on the brink of freedom, ready to start life all over again. No one in the world had any right to weep for her, because she had died. And I too felt ready to start life all over again. It was as if that great rush of anger had washed me clean, emptied me of hope, and gazing up at the dark sky, spangled with its signs and stars, for the first time, I laid my heart open to the benign indifference of the universe. To feel it so like myself, indeed so brotherly, made me realize that I'd been happy, and that I was happy still. For all to be accomplished, for me to feel less lonely, all that remained to hope was that on the day of my execution there should be a huge crowd of spectators, and that they should greet me with howls of execration, that is, cursing and denouncement. Because that's now what he realized he's worthy of. Their denouncement, their rejection. Any thoughts? Really? Shall I share one with you? Notice the relationship between death and freedom. With death so near, Mother must have felt like someone on the brink of freedom, ready to start life over again. He's now facing his execution the next morning, and he feels a kind of freedom he'd never felt before. A lifting off of the weight, a sudden realization for the first time that he's alone in this world, and that the world, that the universe is benignly indifferent, the benign indifference of the world. Good?
Well, I can relate to that very directly.
Mm-hmm.
Under much less dire circumstances, having had essentially the same feeling and feeling profound relief and smiling.
Uh-huh.
The obligation to figure everything out was gone.
Yes.
And the just the wild adventure of it was then present.
Yeah. Yeah. Almost like you can feel yourself for the first time. It's like, oh, this is what life is like. This is what it could potentially be. A kind of opening of opportunity. Yeah? No?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I know that renders as, you know, it leaves one facing the issue of just simply futility or absurdity, but
Mm-hmm.
I've never experienced it personally that way. I know plenty of
Oh,
people
well,
who
you haven't done it right then.
Well, set me straight, would you?
Well, let me see if Camus can set you straight here. Well, for Camus, I mean, for a lot of existentialists, there is this really interesting connection between death and freedom. Heidegger articulates it really well, that freedom, that the experience of freedom, not just, ooh, which toilet paper should I use? Or, ooh, Twinkie or chocolate pudding? Not that kind of freedom, but freedom, the full sense of freedom in its potentiality, in its openness and receptiveness to the world, and in its danger too. I mean, really freedom can be terrifying, and he describes it as a falling toward death. There's a sense in which freedom, to really appreciate freedom, we have to come to terms with and recognize the necessity of our death. We all will die, you young people too. I remember when I was your age, death was the last thing I was thinking of, except when I was inviting it, driving really fast or doing very silly things I won't tell you about. But but really to appreciate freedom as the kind of thing we are, we have to recognize that we all will die, that this life is finite. But freedom is what brings into that finite existence infinite possibility. But to get to that infinite possibility and that understanding of the implications of that for how we live, we have to recognize that there was a time before us and there will be a time after us when we are no longer relevant. So Camus, in his more philosophical writing, this is from the Myth of Sisyphus, and here he develops this concept of absurdity, but it starts in a very simple articulation of a philosophical problem. And Camus says, there is but one truly serious philosophical problem, and that is suicide. This is usually when the class turns all sour. Oh, this sucks. Judging whether life is or is not worth living amounts to answering the fundamental question of philosophy. All the rest, whether or not the world has 3 dimensions, whether the mind has 9 or 12 categories, comes afterward. These are games. One must first answer. And if it is true, as Nietzsche claims, that a philosopher, to deserve our respect, must preach by example, you can appreciate the importance of that reply. for it will precede the definitive act. These are facts the heart can feel, yet they call for careful study before they become clear to the intellect. Why do you think suicide is the first question? Why do you think Camus would, I mean, that's like totally way out there, right? Have you read any other philosopher who says, okay, everybody, first question,
Or
suicide?
maybe you just read Hamlet.
Well,
Maybe you
Hamlet,
just read Hamlet.
yes, Hamlet, to be or not to be. Not to be or not to be Dutch or a prince, but to be or not to be.
In ancient philosophy right now, I'm reading the Phaedo.
Yes.
Socrates does talk about suicide.
Right?
And, discusses that a philosopher, a true philosopher, really the most important thing for him is death. But
That's
that does
Socrates'
rely-
answer to it, right?
Yeah, but it does rely on, I think he's relying on an idea of a soul. So,
Well, excuse me, when Camus referring to Nietzsche here, and he says, and if it's true that a philosopher to deserve our respect must preach by example, you can appreciate the importance of that reply, right? So for Socrates, death, probably for Plato's characterization of Socrates,